Okay, this lecture slide is going over closures, which I know we've already gone over. We've discussed snaps and zippers, but I want to go into a little bit more detail on buttons, buttonholes, hooks, buckles, and other fasteners. In general, you want to make sure that your buttons coordinate with the garment style in the fabric. For example, size is definitely important. Um, the larger the garment, the bigger the print, usually the larger the button. Underlap, overlap portion of a garment is really important. For example, like a peacoat has a really large underlap, overlap portion, but the lap on denim jeans is going to be shorter. Same thing with positioning of the buttons at the center front. With the men's, buttons will be opening to the right and women's will open to the left. The two main button styles are your shank, which are raised above the garment surface, and then your eyed, um, which will have holes in them to sew through that can be 2 or 4. The examples I have on here are just 4-eyed buttons right now. The purpose of the shank is to act as a spacer to keep the garment or to keep the button raised above the garment. So you'll use the shanks when you have heavy, thick fabrics, like if you're using denim, or again, if you've got a pea coat, something with thick. Um, you want to make sure that your buttons and your buttonholes line up. The space between them is the exact same. I'm sorry. Muggsy, no. Ways to reinforce buttons are going to be with interfacing. And you can see on this buttonhole that there's interfacing in between. And then a stay. And here's an example of a stay button. It's will be on the underside of the fashion fabric and directly underneath the fashion button, just as a way to help reinforce it and keep it in place. There are several different types of button compositions. And you just want to know basically which ones can and can't be laundered depending on your target market. Also, if you have a really high-end consumer, you can use leather because you're under the assumption that they can afford dry cleaning. Consider a less expensive button composition. Other types are bone, which you can't use anymore, pearl, or simulated pearl. Those are dressy and they can be dry cleaned. And the two main types of button compositions that are used in ready to wear apparel are your metal and your plastic. Metal can be made very cheap, or it can also be made to look expensive. You can wash it, dry clean it. The only downfall about the metal is that if you leave it in the water too long, it can rust, especially if you've got metal zippers. You want to be careful with those. Plastic is really versatile and probably the most common button composition used. It can be cheap looking, or also look very expensive and attractive in tons of different shapes and colors and finishes. You can even have the simulated pearl buttons made out of plastic. You can wash these, dry them, dry clean them. The only thing is that if you have a cheap button, it can crack with enough heat. So if you wash something enough times and it goes through the dryer enough times on high heat, it has the potential to crack. Variations within the shank button. These are styles that you just want to be able to visually recognize. The pin shank, the tunnel shank, which instead of the eyes, it has more of a flat, smoother surface that the thread goes through. And then the U shank is similar to the tunnel, but it does not have a flat, smooth surface like the tack button. These are not sewn on or threaded, but they're attached with a tack. It's like a nail and a hammer basically, and once the tack it goes into the corresponding piece, so it's two separate pieces. The nail can't come back out. These are the ones that are used on your denim jeans. Two additional types are corded and covered buttons. The image in the top left is going to be a covered button. You can tell it is fabric covered and matches the fashion fabric of the jacket. The button on the top right has got two different types of cords that are, contrasting colors and woven to in some specific design. Bottom right is also covered buttons, just a bunch of various fabrics and then the one on the bottom left is also. Button toggles are also very commonly used in jackets and on purses and in jewelry in a smaller variation. Again, this is just a term you want to be able to recognize and say, oh, that is a toggle closure. So be sure to. Here is an all-encompassing list of fasteners. You want to be able to, again, visually recognize these: buckle, Velcro, drawstring, hook and eye, snaps. Hopefully everybody knows what a safety pin looks like. Moving on to buttonholes. This is the corresponding part of a button closure. The two main categories are going to be your thread finished buttonholes and then your fabric finished buttonholes. Thread finished buttonholes, one variation is rectangular. These are used in wovens, shirts and blouses. The next type is oval. These will be used on knit fabrics, sweaters. Keyhole is typically used in heavyweight fabrics such as denim. Here is an example of it in like a wool felt, and you can see it is in the shape of an antique keyhole. The next major types of buttonholes are going to be fabric finished. Here's the slit or slot, and it will be in a seam. It will just be a finished opening in a stitch seam. So here is a set of three, looks like they're eyed buttons, and the last opening is intended for a button to come through. Here is your fabric finished buttonhole. These are bound or corded, more or less the same thing. When you're talking about a bound buttonhole, it's typically made in the same fashion fabric as the garment. And then if you've got a corded one, the buttonhole opening is usually a little bit thicker and often in a contrasting color. Another way to have a buttonhole or act as a buttonhole is a loop. This was really popular in the 80s, and simply it's a corresponding in the same position as a button, and it doesn't go through a hole. It's just another alternative to a buttonhole. Hooks are another type of closure that's most commonly used. The image on the left here is going to be your lingerie hook. You'll see this in bras and bathing suits. The image on the right is your hook and eye, which you'll see at the tops of series of zippers or in other various places to help keep a placket closed. And last, ties are used not as a means to hold an entire garment closed, but as part of the detail. So you can see there's the jacket, like the trench coat, that has the buttons and then the tie to give it shape. The hoodie has the tie. It's not intended to hold the hood completely around your head, but just help keep it in place. Next, we'll go over buckles. Belts and buckles come in a variety of materials, finishes, weights, shapes, and so on and so on. The purpose of a belt or buckle is to define a waistline, secure a garment in place as a decorative detail or a functional detail. These are all the buckle styles that we'll go over today: the anchor, clasp, a concealed buckle, a covered buckle, a dog leash buckle, a ratchet buckle, and an overall buckle. If you haven't said any of these terms, go ahead and just take a second and say them out loud to yourself here. An anchor buckle is going to be used at the end of a belt or a tab, typically used on outerwear or sportswear garment. It has more of an industrial look and isn't necessarily used in your high-end or couture, but it is commonly seen in your basic ready-to-wear apparel. The clasp is a very common type of closure. It has two separate pieces that come together and that are being not pulled apart, but there's pressure on the corresponding opposite sides that help hold the garment together. So if it's on a belt, the belt will typically have some type of stretch or spandex in it. The bottom example is of a buckle clasp bra holder, and there's the pressure on both sides of it that help pull the clasp closed. A concealed buckle, also called a buckle plate. These are very, very common, and they're used to close a belt, to cover a buckle, or simply to add a design detail for the garment closure. These can be functional or non-functional, and they're used a lot to define brands to make a branding statement. The covered buckle is also very common. It's simply covered either in fabric or it can just be made out of like a plastic. It can be made to match the fashion fabric, to accent, to contrast, and the majority of belts will be covered buckled belts. The dog leash is simply a snap or a hook that has a swivel on the bottom. You can see the image in the bottom right. The bottom piece swivels and moves around, which gives it the common name for the dog leash. A ratchet is another type of buckle that has a spring hinge, used on rain gear, slickers, active sportswear. You'll also see it on duffel bags and backpacks and camping gear. And this is used to help hold things down in place. Of a ratchet holding down a keg and a tank of gasoline. The last type of adjusting buckle is the overall, and this is two separate pieces. One to adjust the distance or the length, and then, well, actually it's three pieces, excuse me. So one to adjust the distance and the length. One is the buckle, and then you have the tack, which is the same type of closure that is used on the jeans. So that's your tack button, which is your jean shank.